Now in his second term, Himes was in Hartford today, and I understand you had some harsh words for perhaps some of your colleagues in Congress about raising the debt ceiling.
Yeah. You know, Susan, we face the same budget challenges at the federal level that we're dealing with here in Connecticut, and it's a very serious discussion how we, over the course of the next 1, 3, 5, 10 years, get our budget in order and start reducing the deficit. That's a very serious issue. The debt ceiling is not a serious issue. The debt ceiling is a fiction that the Congress put in place years ago to make people feel better that there is a debt ceiling. And of course, every couple of years or every year, Congress raises the debt ceiling. The reason it makes me angry is that it allows my colleagues to vote to increase spending or decrease taxes, both of which require more debt, and then turn around and say, no, I don't want to raise the debt ceiling. And not raising the debt ceiling, if we don't do it, means ultimately that Social Security checks don't go out. It means that we don't pay the interest that we owe on our debt. That's pretty catastrophic. I mean, we are playing with the full faith and credit of the United States government if we make this debt ceiling a big deal.
Is it irresponsible to keep raising the debt ceiling?
Well, again, it is critical that we get our debt under control and our deficits under control, but that's done through the budget. That's because people come to the table and they say, we're going to cut programs here, we're going to reform our entitlements to make them sustainable. It doesn't happen because on one day you decide we're not going to borrow any more money. It's a much harder choice than that we face and that we'll be working on. But the debt ceiling is an absurdity because, again, I could say I want to spend more or tax less, but I don't want to raise the debt ceiling. That is a hypocritical thing to do, and the consequences are serious. People lose faith in the political will of the United States government to repay its obligations. We're in a lot of trouble economically.
We're in a lot of trouble now economically, don't you think?
Well, I'll tell you, not as much as we were at the start of my first term. 2 years ago, when I first went to Congress, every single month this country was losing 800,000 jobs. Today, nobody celebrates this recovery, but we're adding 200, 300,000 jobs every single month. The economy's growing, markets have recovered, so we're by no means done with this recovery, but the corner has been turned.
How do you feel about the budget process that's going on in Washington? From an outsider's view, we hear that government is going to shut down, and it seems like there's a lot of political infighting and not a lot of work getting done. Would you agree with that, or?
Well, there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of rhetoric, and yes, there was a lot of risk of a government shutdown. We averted that, and we actually averted that with a bipartisan vote in the Congress, and that's a good thing. And I don't agree that, all is lost. The reality is that when we talk about getting the budget under control, the specifics of that are no fun to talk about. We're talking about cutting programs that some people like or all people like. We're talking about some very difficult things, changes in the tax code. How do we restructure Medicare to make it sustainable in a fair and just way? These are hard things to talk about. But the interesting thing is they're being talked about. In the Senate today, there are what's known as the Gang of Six working to try to figure out how to make a deal around, you'll remember the Simpson-Bowles Commission. This was the President's Debt Reduction Commission. They put a proposal on the table that had it all. It had all of the aspects of spending, all of the difficult decisions. I'm one of the few members of the House that has said that he would vote for that proposal should it come before the Congress. In the Senate, they are working on it. And that's the way we need to think. Everybody coming to the table and saying, there will be moments of uncomfortableness for me here, but the only way we solve it is if we come to the table with no sacred cows and, hold hands and jump in the pool together.
Now, I know the Republicans were pushing the Ryan budget, and I believe Connecticut's congressional delegation all voted against it. Do you feel that it's just too fringe, that it does not represent the values or the interests of people, especially your constituents?
Well, there were a bunch of problems with the Ryan budget, which, yes, the House passed over without a single Democratic vote, which should say something. But here were the policy problems. One, the way Ryan is proposing to deal with the very significant challenge of Medicare is an outrage. Basically, what Ryan says is instead of guaranteeing you good health care as a senior, we're going to give you a voucher. And that voucher over time is going to cover less and less of your health care expenses. Now, that's one way of taking the burden off of the federal government, but all you're doing is you're shifting that burden onto individual seniors. There's a much smarter way, which is tougher, but let's reduce the annual increase in the cost of health care. That's the answer, not just saying, seniors, you're on your own. Ryan also would not even balance the budget. His proposal doesn't come close to balancing the budget, but he proposes staggeringly large cuts to things like education, to food inspectors, to the FAA, you name it. And he uses the money that he saves there to offer yet more tax cuts that would benefit a very small and very wealthy portion of this country. And that's just, given where we've been in the last couple of years, that's not good policy.
I mean, you're talking about how in a bill like Orion's proposal, you have 100% of Democrats who are voting against it. Do you think that there are a lot of philosophical differences, and perhaps that's just being highlighted here?
Well, of course there's philosophical differences between the parties, and that's a good thing. I mean, people often say the partisanship is so intense. Why is that? And they're right. The partisanship does boil over all too frequently in Washington. The fact is we've got different parties with different visions, and our system is all about the competition of those visions. I'm a Democrat because I don't agree, as the Ryan budget would do, that the answer to our budget mess lies in asking the most vulnerable, our elderly, our sick, and our poor to give up whatever benefits are keeping them, off the thin ice. That's just not the way a country that values its people should be legislating. Not that we don't have tough choices, not that we won't have to make some very painful cuts to programs like that, but those cuts don't go to fund more tax cuts for people who don't need tax cuts. That's just not who we are as a people.
You've not always voted on party lines. Can you elaborate on that and why?
Sure. Look, it's partly who I am. I did not grow up in the political system. I'm a Democrat for a reason, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to follow necessarily the leadership's lead, and I accumulated one of the more independent voting records in my first term in Congress. But also, the people I represent, I'm fortunate to represent a good, smart, educated district. They don't want somebody, Republican or Democrat, who's going to vote on party lines. They want somebody who thinks about the issues and then independently comes to a conclusion, listens to them, and votes according to that rather than just being a party person.
A lot of people are concerned about taxes right now, certainly at the state level. They're talking about the largest tax increase in state history. Where do you see that going on a federal level, and will we be hit on both sides?
Well, it's hard to know this early in the game. But when I say, and I think the key rule here is that everybody comes to the table with no ultimatums, no sacred cows. One of the things that in particular the Republicans need to come to the table with is the possibility that we're going to make changes in the tax code. Is it crazy to think that we might go back to the tax rates that we had during the Clinton administration in the 90s? Those were pretty economically prosperous times. That happens, though, because we all agree to put some things on the table that are painful. If you want the Democrats to come to the table and say, we're going to talk about cuts to education, to Pell Grants, talk about reforming Social Security, everybody needs to come to the table willing to take some pain around things that they care a lot about.
I heard someone at the state capitol say recently, everybody's in favor of progress as long as it doesn't affect them.
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what happens in these very difficult discussions about the budget. You say, we've got a comprehensive plan to fix the budget, and everybody says, that's great, we should fix the budget. And it includes A, B, C, and D, and people say, wait a minute, I don't like A, B, C, or D, and because when you get specific is when this really becomes a challenging discussion.
Coming up after the break, more from Congressman Himes, the health care debate, and death threats made against him and other lawmakers. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face the State. Congresswoman Gabby Giffords is still recovering after being shot in Tucson, Arizona in a shopping mall plaza. 6 people were killed that day, and that concerned a lot of lawmakers who started to worry about their own safety. Before we talk about you, can you tell us, you understand that there's some good news with Gabby Giffords, and you've had some contact or understanding her condition is much better now. Yeah,
no, and you're right. I mean, that was such a deeply personal assault to so many of us who were great friends with Gabby, young member of the House. But her recovery has been absolutely miraculous. I mean, she was shot point blank in the head, and she's recovering well, and she'll be in Florida to watch her husband command the space shuttle launch that is to occur soon. So she seems to be making good progress.
That had to have shocked you and other lawmakers who take it almost for granted that you can gather just about anywhere and meet people. Did that disturb you and scare you?
Yeah, there was a moment of that, no doubt. And then, then the sort of rational faculties kick back in and you realize that this doesn't happen very often. But no, in fact, interestingly, 2 days later on a Monday, I did a town hall in Westport, Connecticut, and there were 70 people there. And it was such an emotional thing. I felt so good that people who themselves were at risk. I mean, remember, the 6 people that were killed there, some of them, of course, being participants in her town hall. But people showed up. And I think at the end of the day, people, even if it didn't affect them personally, realize, wait a second, our system of government is about my ability to go down to town hall and talk to my elected representatives and, you know, give them ideas, praise them, yell at them, whatever. But I'll tell you, when you create fear and you separate that, you're really sticking a knife in our system.
What about security? Is that really feasible and doable? Can you really have security around you all the time? You probably can't.
Well, no. I mean, is it feasible? I suppose so. But again, you know, I mean, we're at a point in time for a whole bunch of reasons, economic and otherwise, where people are feeling a little distanced from their government, and they wonder, is the government really doing the right thing? And the last thing I think we need is, you know, come through a metal detector or get searched or whatever before you get to meet the person that you sent to Washington. That's just not the way our system should work.
And I understand you are a proponent of gun legislation. Tell us about that.
Sure. And look, I'll start by saying that I like shooting myself, and I'm a supporter of Second Amendment rights, and I'm just so frustrated by the debate, which, by the way, there really is no debate. But don't you think, I certainly do, that we can agree that responsible gun owners should have the right, as guaranteed by the Constitution, to have a gun. But let's also agree that people who are mentally deranged or have criminal backgrounds, they shouldn't have that right. We can also probably agree that, you know, there's a certain technology that is permissible, what you need to defend yourself or to hunt, but weaponry that is designed for really nothing other than to kill lots of people quickly, for military uses or for law enforcement uses. I'm talking about automatic weapons. I'm talking about what this shooter in Arizona had, a 30-round clip. There's just not either a sports or a personal protection justification for that kind of equipment. And when it falls into the wrong hands, it can be absolutely deadly.
Well, here at the state level, people who are responsible gun owners feel that, you know, criminals are going to break the law, and there's nothing that you can do about that. And to kind of penalize responsible gun owners from not being able to have a gun and have to reload all the time during target practice, they feel that that's unfair.
Well, again, I mean, people have the right to bear arms, and the question is, what kind of arms are we talking about? And if we could find a way to take the most deadly weapons off the street and just get rid of them and make sure that nobody but the military and law enforcement has them, they're not going to turn up in a parking lot in Arizona and result in 6 deaths. You know, this shooter in Arizona was finally stopped when he had to stop to reload, and that should tell us something. So again, it's just a reasonable standard. You know, you get to bear arms if you're responsible and if those arms are appropriate for your use and not lethal to the community.
You mentioned about mental illness, and I know here in Connecticut, after the lottery shootings, they passed legislation several years later because the person at the time was considered a threat and they were dangerous, but they couldn't take his guns away because he had not been convicted of any crime. And some lawmakers feel that by enacting that, which gives the courts the ability to go in and to assess the situation, maybe take guns away from people, Connecticut hasn't become, you know, a Columbine or, you know, a Virginia Tech.
Yeah, maybe. Look, again, it's a what's reasonable is the question. I mean, courts regularly put protection orders on people. You know, even though no crime perhaps has been committed, I think if you have reasonable cause to believe that somebody could be a lethal threat, you know, there ought to be an ability to, at a minimum, monitor what sort of weapons an individual has. Again, it's the unfortunate thing is that I suspect that most Americans could agree on these basic standards of reasonableness, but it's not a debate that we unfortunately have much in Washington. The pro-gun lobbies says that if you start that conversation, you lose. We should have that conversation. There's just people dying all over this country. I mean, imagine 20, 30,000 gun deaths a year in the United States. That's 10 times the number of people we lost in 9/11. We mobilized the United States government and went to war after 9/11, but we can't have a conversation about how to reduce gun deaths in this country.
On a lighter note, and I don't know if it really is, but you've had some town hall meetings, and I'm sure you've had an earful from your constituents and people in Connecticut who are certainly feeling the pinch from the economy. The jobless rate, as you know, is higher here in Connecticut than it is in the nation. I understand we're kind of the last to go into the recession, but and the last to come out. So What are you hearing from people at these town hall meetings?
Yeah, you know, the town hall meetings that I did 4 of them in the district, really had 2 purposes. One was to just sort of educate people on where the challenges are. You know, a lot of people are running around thinking that foreign aid is a big deal in our budget. Well, it's less than 1%. And by all means, let's debate it, but let's not believe that that is going to fix our budget issues. You know, the challenges are really much more in the long run, the promises that we have made through, for example, Medicare, which we want to preserve. It's a spectacular program. Seniors love it. Many of us will rely on it, but we need to make it sustainable, and we need to do that in a just and equitable way. What I found, and my other objective was to get feedback from people, was, with some exceptions, because you've always got, you know, some people who come to these meetings to really pound a point home, but people understand that there are trade-offs. They understand that none of these decisions are easy or fun to talk about, but I actually was pretty impressed by how reasonable people were. I would contrast them with, you know, when we were going 2 years ago through the healthcare town hall meetings. There you really had just, you know, an overwhelming passion and emotion for and against. This was a much more sort of civil and down-to-earth discussion.
I think people are very concerned about Social Security and some of these programs and whether they're going to be around for a future generation.
Yeah, no, and it's a fair concern. Social Security is a program that you know, is probably one of the most successful social programs that this nation has ever implemented. When it was started back in the 1930s, our seniors had a very high level of poverty. Over the years, thanks to Social Security, actually most seniors don't live in poverty. So the question is not should the program exist or not. Most people agree it should exist. But how do you change it to make sure that it's sustainable? So do you change the deal for current retirees? No way. Nobody's talking about, you know, changing the deal for current Social Security recipients or even those people who are close to it. But for people who are in their 30s and 40s, many of whom don't believe that Social Security is going to be there at all for them, maybe the deal changes a little bit. Maybe that cap on which wages are no longer withheld goes up a little bit. Maybe the retirement age over time goes up a little bit. If you do these things, Social Security is fine.
I know we're running out of time, but quickly, we hear now at the state level we're broke. Are we broke in Washington too?
Well, broke is sort of a funny concept in Washington, right? Because we can borrow. The fact is we can't borrow forever, and we have reached the point where we can borrow a little bit more. We've got a little bit of time. Nobody's saying we're going to be Greece tomorrow, but we do need a plan so that we start to pay down that debt, get rid of the deficits, and put us on a more sustainable course.
Congressman Jim Himes, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll come back.
Thank you. Sure will.
All right. Thank you.